Three men. Three men who between them built something that would shape an entire nation for a century. Paul Cullen, Éamon de Valera, John Charles McQuaid. The architect, the lawyer, and the foreman. Each one believed with total sincerity and total certainty that he was doing God's work. Each one believed he was protecting the people. Each one believed the Ireland he was building was the Ireland that needed to exist. And here's the thing. They weren't wrong about what Ireland wanted. At least not entirely. But there's something that happens when fear gets into the foundation of a system. Something quiet. Something that takes decades to see clearly. Fear reshapes faith into control. And that across every religion, every culture, every century is how so many of the great evils in the name of God came to exist. Free Barabbas. Free Barabbas. We'll come to that. But first, you have to understand what Ireland had already been through before any of these men ever picked up a single stone. Imagine for a second you're Irish in the mid-19th century. Your great-grandparents lived under colonial rule so total that practicing your religion was at points illegal. Your grandparents saw landlords export food while 1 million people starved. Your parents were born into the wreckage of that famine, a famine that killed 1 in 8 people on this island and drove another 1 million to emigrate almost overnight. Then in your own lifetime, a war of independence, a brutal civil war immediately after, poverty, mass emigration, a new country that had to somehow hold itself together with almost nothing. What does that do to a people? Well, we know what that does. Psychologists have studied this in cultures around the world, that societies living under prolonged trauma develop a very particular relationship with certainty, with order, with anything that promises that the chaos will not return. They don't want mercy. Mercy is unpredictable. Mercy is a gamble. What they want is structure. They want rules. They want someone to tell them, if you do this and this and this, then you'll be safe. Your children will be safe. After generations of chaos, certainty feels safer than mercy. And in Ireland, there was one institution, one single institution that had been there through all of it. Through the penal laws, through the famine, through the war. One institution that ran the schools, the hospitals, the orphanages. One institution that buried your dead and baptized your living and sat with you when nothing was left. It's the Catholic Church. Not the British state, not the landlords, not any political party. The church. So when those 3 men began to build, they weren't building on sand. They were building on the deepest bedrock of trust that a traumatized people could offer. And that's important. Keep that in mind for everything that follows. Paul Cullen arrives in Ireland in 1850, right in the aftermath of the famine, as the most powerful Catholic churchman the country had ever seen. He'd spent decades in Rome. He knew how the Vatican operated at the highest level. And he looked at the Irish Catholicism and saw something he wanted to fix. Before Cullen, Irish Catholicism was messy. Folk traditions mixed with official church doctrine, patterns and holy wells and local customs that would have made Rome deeply uncomfortable. The church at this time had influence, yes, but it was loose and it was local, decentralized, human. Cullen changed that. He imported Roman discipline wholesale. He centralized authority. He built the infrastructure, the schools, the seminaries. He linked the parishes together. He officialized the hierarchy that turned a scattered, organic faith into a coherent, structured institution. He didn't replace Irish faith. He gave it walls. He gave it floors and ceilings and locked doors. He didn't just bring faith, he built it as a scaffolding. And here's the critical thing about what Cullen built. Before him, the church simply didn't have the structural power to do what came later. It couldn't, at this time, sweep things under the rug at scale. It couldn't silence people with institutional authority. It couldn't take children from families and place them in industrial schools in the kind of systematic, legitimized force. The machinery for that didn't exist yet. Cullen built the machinery. And not because he wanted to use it in that way. As far as we can tell, he genuinely believed that he was saving souls. But intent doesn't determine the outcome. The scaffolding that he built was real, and it was waiting. The man it was waiting for was Éamon de Valera. We fast forward to 1937. Ireland has been independent for 15 years, and Éamon de Valera, the Taoiseach, revolutionary veteran and deeply devout Catholic, sits down to write a new constitution. He didn't just write a legal document, he wrote a moral vision. The 1937 constitution gave the Catholic Church a special position in Irish society. It enshrined Catholic social teaching on the family, on women, on education, on divorce. It didn't just reflect the values of Catholic Ireland, it locked them in, made them law, made them the definition of what it meant to be Irish. Think about what that means in practice. It means that if your values, your family structure, your sexuality, your beliefs about your own body didn't align with the Catholic Church, well then you weren't just sinful. You were, in some legal and civic sense, not fully Irish. De Valera didn't invent that feeling. It already existed. He just gave it the force of law. And with that, the scaffolding Cullen built now had a legal legitimacy. It wasn't just the church saying, this is how things should be. It was the state saying, this is how things are. Which brings us to McQuaid. John Charles McQuaid, Archbishop of Dublin from 1940 to 1972. And this is the one people find most surprising when they dig into the history. McQuaid was popular, genuinely, widely popular. He built schools, he built hospitals. He personally intervened in cases of poverty and hardship. People wrote to him directly and he responded. He was, by many accounts, tireless in his pastoral care for ordinary Dubliners. But he was also the man who killed the Mother and Child Scheme in 1951, free healthcare for mothers and children under 16, because he decided it would undermine the church's authority over family life. He lobbied politicians directly. He won. The scheme died. And that's the McQuaid paradox. He genuinely cared for people, and he used every lever of the system to ensure that care remained on his terms, under his authority, within his walls. He didn't just accept the scaffolding Cullen built and the legal home that De Valera gave it. He walked every beam of it, every day, making sure that nobody stepped off of that scaffolding. Under McQuaid, the system reached its operational peak. Church authority over education, total. Over hospitals, total. And over social policy, total. Dissent wasn't just discouraged. It was, in a deeply communal, small town country where your reputation was everything, socially catastrophic. And this is where the machinery that Cullen built, the legal home de Valera gave it, and McQuaid's hands-on enforcement all meet. This is the moment that the system becomes capable of what comes next. Now I want to pause here, because I think that the temptation when you learn this in history is to cast it as a story about villains imposing control on victims. And that misses something fundamental in this story. The people wanted this. And not in a cynical way, not in an uninformed way, in a deeply human way. The way any community that has been through sustained trauma reaches for the thing that feels like safety. In small town Ireland, your standing in the community was everything. Conformity wasn't just social pressure, it was survival infrastructure. And national identity, that was huge. To be Irish after centuries of being told that you were less than was to be Catholic. Moral strictness, it was pride, not just oppression. It was, we are not the chaotic, godless empire that starved us. We are ordered. We are virtuous. We are something. This wasn't a top-down control. It was a ground-up demand for certainty. The three men, they didn't impose a system on an unwilling population. They built the system that the population was asking for. And then, crucially, they built it in ways that meant it couldn't be questioned. It couldn't be reformed either from outside or from within. It couldn't be held accountable. Because that's what happens when you build on fear. Fear doesn't just want order. It wants order that can't be challenged, because challenge feels like the chaos returning. So what happens when a system like this has no accountability? You already know the answer. The Ryan Report in 2009, the Murphy Report, the Tuam mother and baby home, Magdalene Laundries, industrial schools where children were beaten and abused for decades, and where the church, the state, and the community all collectively chose not to see it. Not because everyone was evil, that's the easy version. The harder version is the system was structured so that seeing it was almost impossible. Trust in the church was so absolute that accusations against it were, by definition, suspicious. The state had handed over responsibility to the church, and in doing so, had handed over accountability as well. There was no real independent oversight. There were no external checks. When you have absolute authority, absolute trust, and zero accountability, abuse doesn't just become possible, it becomes almost inevitable. Because the mechanisms that would normally surface and stop abuses like this, they've been removed. Systems shaped by fear are easily weaponized. The scaffolding that Cullen built, the legal legitimacy that de Valera gave it, and the operational grit that McQuaid maintained. When those three things combine, and when the people trust them completely, because that trust is the only thing standing between them and the chaos that they remember, you get a system that can do almost anything in the dark. So, Barabbas. The gospel story is simple. Pilate offers the crowd a choice: Jesus or Barabbas. Jesus, who has spent 3 years teaching forgiveness, mercy, and upending of every power structure. Or Barabbas, a known figure, a rebel, someone the crowd understood. And the crowd chooses Barabbas. Theologians have written endlessly about what that means. But when I look at this story through the lens of what we've just been talking about, what I see is a crowd under enormous pressure. They're under occupation, they are under trauma, reaching for a figure that feels solid and known, strong, not the unpredictable teacher who talks about turning the other cheek or loving enemies or giving away everything you own. The other one, the one who makes sense to this crowd. Ireland chose institutional Catholicism with all its certainty and structure and moral clarity over the more uncomfortable, less controllable spiritual alternative. Not because they were stupid, because they were scared. Because after everything that they'd been through, certainty felt like grace. And this isn't only an Irish story, it's a human story, it's a global story. Look at the history of the Ku Klux Klan. It claimed Christian authority. It used the language of moral protection of the community, of families, of a way of life under threat. That language of protection wrapped in religious legitimacy is exactly how fear-driven systems recruit and sustain themselves. Look at certain strains of American evangelicism today, the ones driven primarily by fear of secularism, fear of cultural change, fear of losing influence. When faith becomes mainly a defense mechanism against a threatening world, well, it stops looking like the Sermon on the Mount and it starts looking like a fortress. And fortresses have walls for keeping things in as much as for keeping things out. I'm not saying every religious institution is the same. I'm not saying that faith itself is a problem. What I'm saying is, when fear is the foundation, the building it produces will always tend towards control, every time, across every tradition, across every century. So where does all this leave us? Paul Cullen, Éamon de Valera, John Charles McQuaid, the architect, the lawyer, the foreman, none of them set out to build a machine for abuse. Cullen wanted a disciplined, respectable church for a people who needed anchoring. And de Valera, he wanted a moral nation, proud and distinct after centuries of humiliation and oppression. McQuaid wanted to care for people, and he did in real, tangible ways for many of them. But Cullen built the scaffolding without building accountability, and de Valera, he took it wholesale and gave it legal legitimacy without building any oversight. And McQuaid ran it hard with total authority, in a culture so conditioned to trust and defer that no one, not even the good people inside it, could stop what the system was capable of in its darkest corners. These three men, they weren't villains. They were builders, and the country trusted them. Because after centuries of chaos, famine, colonialism, war, loss, certainty felt like safety. Institutions felt like salvation, and a God of order felt much more manageable than a God of unpredictable, demanding, structureless mercy. The question I want to leave you with isn't about Ireland. It's about now. It's about wherever you are. What symptoms of certainty are you trusting today because they feel like safety? What institutions have you handed your accountability to because questioning them feels like inviting the chaos? And what would it take, not to tear them down, but to build in the oversight, the humility, the willingness to be wrong that the builders of Catholic Ireland never did? What systems of fear do we still trust today? Let me know in the comments. My name is Jacob, and this might be church.